We want to open today first by recognizing the privilege that we have to share the land that each of us occupies here in Saskatchewan and Ontario and wherever you may be. We know that many disparate groups have come to call this land home, and we are grateful to the Indigenous folks, the Indigenous peoples, and their ancestors and the sacrifices that have been made so that each of us may be able to live and learn on these lands. And so I would begin today by introducing all of you to our panelists today. And so I'm Dr. Osmond Johnson, Pamela Osmond Johnson, and I am an associate professor of educational leadership with Faculty of Education at the University of Regina. And I am so pleased and happy to be joined by my fellow panelists here today. And so I will hand it over to Anne and then Jackie to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Pamela, for that. It's really an honor to participate in this webinar. I am Anne Lopez, and I'm a professor of Ed Leadership at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto. I'm also the director for the Centre for Leadership and Diversity and support the Provost's Access initiatives. Looking forward to the conversation. Dr. Button?
Yes, and hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Jackie Button. I'm a vice principal in the Halton District School Board. I'm also an instructor in the master's program at Queen's University. And it's really great to be here and be part of such an esteemed group, and look forward to the conversation as well.
Well, thank you to you both. I'm also looking forward to the conversation today, and we've got lots of great things to talk about. And so before we kind of get into the panel, we'd also like to take an opportunity to thank EdCan, who are obviously the host for us today. And also a special thank you to Benita for providing all of the technical expertise to help us continue to move along in these online spaces that have apparently become our current mode of communication. So thank you for that. And so we're going to move into the agenda. And so just to give you an idea of the sorts of things that we're going to be discussing today. And so we're going to begin with some discussion of kind of the changing landscape around workload and advocacy that has been necessitated by the COVID-19 pandemic and schools for school leaders. And then Anne is going to discuss and move into how it is that we maintain a focus on equity and amongst all of this. And Jackie is going to be sharing with us some reflections on practice in terms of her work as a school leader currently in the system. And so really looking forward to hearing from Jackie and all of the fantastic things that we can learn from the school leaders that are doing this every day. And then,
sorry, Pam, sorry, and I hate to interrupt. It sounds like we're having some difficulty with people hearing you speak, and they were able to hear Anne and I, and unfortunately, it looks like in the comments, they're not able to hear.
Okay, I'm turning up my volume. My fellow panelists, are you folks able to hear me? Yes? Okay, okay, we see here that others are saying that they can hear as well. So if anyone is having technical difficulties and is having difficulties hearing, it may be best to perhaps log out and log back in. There may be some technical difficulties on your end. I think that most people here are able to hear. Thank you for that, Jackie. And so back to the agenda, Anne is going to conclude and summarize with some final thoughts, and then we will move to a Q&A session and give you folks an opportunity to be able to engage and ask some of your brilliant questions. And so we've kind of organized our session today around two overarching questions. The first is what has been learned so far about leading schools through COVID-19, and with a particular focus on school-based leaders. And then a lot of our focus is going to be on how do we ensure that equity and social justice don't get lost along the way. And so looking forward to that. So the first thing here is that I will begin by kind of having a bit of a summary about some of the things that we've learned so far about the changing landscapes that school leaders now find themselves in now that schools have reopened. In most jurisdictions, schools have been open for approximately a month, a little less than that in some areas, but a few weeks for sure. And so I think maybe the first thing is really important to note is that school leadership was already at a crossroads even prior to COVID-19 and the closing of schools across the country last spring. There's been a lot of research in Canada by Pollock, Wang, and Houseman, work by the Ontario Principals Council, the Alberta Teachers Association. All of these folks have been engaged in examining the principalship and the workload issues and have pointed to some really important ongoing issues around workload intensification and the difficulties that school leaders are facing in terms of work-life balance, shifts in the autonomy, where school leaders are increasingly being asked to be responsible for policies and regulations that they're not responsible for creating. And a lot of this research has pointed us to concerns and increasing concerns and ongoing conversations around declines in the quality of life and well-being for school leaders and the increased rates of burnout and turnover that we've been seeing in the ranks of school administrators across the country for the last number of years. And so, you know, COVID in many ways has exacerbated these dilemmas, exacerbated these issues. But along the way, it has also created new dilemmas and new issues around workload and managing the day-to-day operations of a school that now includes a huge health and safety component. And again, a lot of principals have felt that they have not been a part of the conversation, that they were not necessarily consulted about the ways in which these health and safety policies can actually be implemented on the ground, and the challenges that that has created in reopening schools and being the leaders responsible for those day-to-day operations. And so it's really important that we start to think about, in the context of all of the issues that the research had already previously identified around school leaders and their work. And now with this added addition of COVID-19 and all of the pieces that that brings, it's really important for us to be thinking about how we understand effective school leadership and the work of school leaders and how we're going to support them in this work. And again, not even to mention at this point the challenges around equity and the pieces that principals need to be paying attention to in that realm as well. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some work that I've just recently started with the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. And just for those of you that are located in different areas around the country, principal organizations look different in different provinces. And so in Ontario, for instance, the principals are not part of the teacher federations. They have their own group, the Ontario Principals Council. In other provinces in Canada, school principals are actually a part of the teacher federation. And so the teacher federation is more broadly encompassing of all educators in that system. And so I'm located in the province of Saskatchewan, and here school administrators are a part of the Teacher Federation. And so I've recently partnered with the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation to do a focus group series, mostly to provide an opportunity for school leaders to come together and to be able to share their experiences, to talk about what's going well, to talk about the challenges that they're facing. And along the way, I'm hoping to be able to gather some information around some of the pieces that can be shared, across systems, to be able to better understand what's happening in the lives of school leaders at this moment. And so, in terms of the new dilemmas, what I'm sharing here is data that has initial data that's come out of these conversations with school leaders. And so we are in the very early stages of this project at this point. Um, but some really interesting things have been talked about so far, that I wanted to share. And so one of them is this notion of fuzzy policies. And that was a quote that one of the participants recently said, I'm here and I'm responsible for all of these health and safety policies. Um, but there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of fuzziness and blurred lines in these policies. And so parents will call the health hotlines and they'll be told one thing about how they're supposed to respond to either symptoms or being exposed to a positive case. And that's not necessarily the policy that I've been given as a principal to direct in my school. And so there was a lot of concerns around what they called plugging gaps in the guidelines, that the guidelines weren't clear, that different levels within the organizations of schooling and health were providing guidelines that weren't necessarily in alignment with each other, and that they were very um, that they were very concerned about how long they could continue going on trying to provide direction and plugging these gaps in guidelines. They also talked about being stuck in the middle, where they were being held accountable for these health and safety policies that they didn't create. And the challenges that that brought sometimes in dealing with parents who were not necessarily understanding of all of the guidelines. Um, Particularly, there were seemed to be some challenges around uh, opinions of masking. Some parents feeling that things were not, that the masking policies didn't go far enough. Others who felt that the masking policies went too far, were too rigid, and the principal commented about being stuck in the middle of trying to navigate and negotiate these differing expectations from parents, from students, from others, all around policies that they are responsible for implementing, of which, again, they've had very little input in creating. Um, they were also worried about the social emotional well-being of others. Very concerned about what COVID fatigue and how things were going to go in the school once the initial monotony of once the day-to-day life, the new kind of day-to-day life in schools, once that kind of got a bit old and boring for people. They're starting to worry about that at this point. And worried about the workload of teachers and other staff in the school and all of the different pieces. Worried about students that are not, um, that are not that don't have access readily to online learning, but who also have health issues and who are not able to be in face to face. They talked about worrying about issues of equity amongst students and who's being able to take advantage of the opportunities that are being provided. But they didn't worry very much about their own health and well being, which in many ways I think is a little bit troubling. And when asked, what is it that you need to be better supported, they had a lot of difficulty in being able to articulate that. And being able to recognize that it was okay for them to be able to actually to need support as well. And so quickly before I go to Anne, there's a big role here for principal organizations to play in creating these kinds of opportunities for school leaders to be able to come together and share challenges and solutions, to be able to advocate on their behalf in terms of, sharing all of the pieces that really continue to need further thought and further attention. Um, and engaging with the kinds of research partnerships that the Teacher Federation here and I are doing, to be able to document both the struggles and successes that school leaders are having during this time, so that we can, know more about what's happening from the school leadership side of things at this point, and the context that's playing out on their end, and what we're going to continue to learn about leading schools through COVID-19 as this year continues. And so, again, it's also very important to note that COVID-19 is not existing in a vacuum, and it's not the only thing that school administrators have to be paying attention to. There are many other social inequities that have continued to be ignored and that need to be front and center right now. And so some of them also worried about how they were going to be able to manage that on top of all of these other pieces. And so with that, I will pass to Anne, who's going to share a little bit more about the focus on equity.
Thanks, Pamela. That's so you've really sort of laid the foundation very nicely in terms of some of the issues and the realities and what I sometimes like to refer to as the complexities of school leadership. And so, what I'm going to share now is really, first of all, I like that second question that you sort of asked at the start of this, and how do school leaders maintain a focus on social justice, and how do they keep that at the center of their work and their practice? So, what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be sharing some ideas around that. And so, first of all, to acknowledge that COVID really has created different working conditions for school leaders that you have mentioned and sort of paid more attention to and heard about, particularly in your focus group. The first thing that I would like to share around social justice and issues of equity for all of the participants on our webinar today who might be listening is that it has to be embedded in practice. It has to become part of everyday school leadership practices. It cannot be an approach to the side. It is something that we're going to do time. It is so that's the first thing I would want to say in terms of how do we do that? How do we keep it at the center of practice? So some suggestions that I have is drawn on research that I have done here in the GTA with school leaders, and I also do research in Jamaica and Kenya as well with school leaders, school principals, vice principal, and teacher leaders as well. And the first thing is that it has to come from a place where I would suggest and recommend that it becomes part of that self reflective piece. Take some time to think through, as school leaders, how am I going to commit myself? What is it that I believe and what is it that I need to learn about? So, the first thing I would suggest is that there has to be some kind of self reflection, and from that, a commitment. So there has to be a commitment to doing how we theorize it in many ways. It matters less whether we call it culturally responsive leadership, whether we call it social justice leadership, whether we call it anti-racist leadership. I think it's the critical approach. It's the kind of practice comes from that. So I think that's the first thing. Commit. Say it to ourselves as school leaders, we are going to commit to doing this work. And I think this summer, all of the events of this summer really brought that to the fore, that students, Black, Indigenous students of color need those practices to be successful. The second part of that I would say in terms of the commitment, those school leaders who are in schools where they might have a predominantly white population, that those knowledge and those practices are also very important. So that's the first piece that I would suggest, how do we keep that focus, is a commitment to the work. So then once there is that critical self-reflection, a commitment to whether it's culturally responsive, anti-racist, social justice, a different way of thinking about leadership. The second piece, or another suggestion I would make, is that there has to be some intentionality. And what do I mean by intentionality? That means that practice, how we go about having conversations with students. We're now living through COVID. We're balancing many things. What is that conversation with parents? What will that look like? How do we address students who might not have all of the necessary resources? Or I've been reading, doing a lot of reading, a lot of engaging. And one of the things that I've noticed is that some educators are suggesting, oh, how about students putting on their cameras? What does that mean? How do we get students to engage if their cameras are not on? So, again, keeping social justice, keeping equity at the center means do not judge. It means talking to the parents, talking to the students as to exactly what is happening in their lives. So that's that intentionality and that commitment that is so very important for school leaders. Something you touched on briefly, Pam, that I think is so important, and that's policy. And we oftentimes, as school leaders, we spend a lot of time and we focus on practice, but we also need to think about how are we implementing those educational policies that school leaders have to implement on the ground. What does that look like? Are there, are we being asked, are school leaders being asked to implement policies that might have negative impact on some students? So again, many of us have, whether children or grandchildren or cousins or nephews or nieces in schools, we're hearing conversations around spacing. We're hearing conversations around how afraid and scared some school leaders are. So it is really in this moment thinking about, as you've said, Pam, how do they balance well-being and the intentionality to ensure that social justice equity doesn't become an add-on but becomes part of and is embedded. So the intentionality. The second suggestion, or third suggestion, that I would make around keeping equity at the center of practice is really to suggest to school leaders to think of this as a journey. Now, some folks might, have different notions of that, but truly, I say to school leaders that think of this work as a journey, that you can't undo all of the inequities in society one day in 1 month. As black folks would oftentimes say, we're not going to undo 400 or years of injustice in a month. So really think of this as a journey, and make that be part of practice and planning. So when you're planning your weekly or daily, ask the questions: how am I advancing the work of equity today or tomorrow or this week? Another suggestion, another practical suggestion, is to really continue to do some reading. And this is something maybe we haven't maybe paid enough attention to, that when we as school leaders begin to engage in equity work and we're committed and we're being intentional, it's not just reading one article and then it's over. It's really ensuring that we continue to understand contexts, understand communities. What is there to learn, as I like to say? What is there to unlearn, and what is there to relearn? And so it's really very important to ensure that there's readings and there continue to go beyond the one reading or the resources that we're used to doing. I think also I would say to school leaders is ensure that there is a collaborative community and learning space within the school as the micro and outside of the school. I think Pamela touched in this in terms of creating space where school leaders can get together and begin to talk about some of the issues and challenges that they're having. So in order to ensure that equity it doesn't become like additional work, that it doesn't feel like it's another burden to carry. And I'm one of those critical scholars and educators who really disrupt that notion of equity work being positioned as a load, as it's something else to take on, as it's going to be challenging. In fact, that is what we should be doing. Our practice should be equitable. So again, find that collaborative community within the school and outside of the school to engage and to really sort of discuss and have and ways in which difficult and challenging issues can be discussed and be deconstructed. So it's really important. The other things that I would really suggest to school leaders, I know there are many critical theories that are around. Now we are focusing again on anti-racist education, and that is really dominant in the discourse. Of course, many of us know that anti-racist education is not new. There's a Canadian scholar by the name of Enid Lee, who back in the 80s was talking about anti-racist education, and George Day and other scholars. And then we had culturally responsive leadership, and then we have, different ways, decolonizing leadership, and so on. What I would suggest to school leaders is to find synergies between the theories that we're engaging with. So if your board is focused on culturally responsive work, or another board might be focused anti-racist work, another board might be focused on anti-oppressive work, it's really to recognize that it's about the synergies that we can find in these ways of thinking and theorizing from which practice will emerge, because the practice is going to come from the philosophy. So spend some time thinking, what do I understand about this, and what is it going to look like in practice? And so, for example, now, and us critical scholars, we're very excited that now we can engage in conversations about white supremacy without having to spend a lot of time working through resistance. In many ways, there is still resistance, don't get me wrong, but now it is enough. It is in the discourse so that folks are beginning to understand what white supremacy is all about. How is this manifested in policies and school practices? And so, again, to say to school leaders to keep equity at the center of what we're doing, we've got to spend some time reflecting on white supremacy. What does that mean? Do we have to make changes in the discipline policies? It's COVID time. Things are difficult. We have to balance our well being. We have to balance, as Pamela assured, all of the different things that school leaders have been asked to do. But I would suggest really to ground oneself in this thinking and work. And always, I used to be a classroom teacher, and when you're planning lessons, we have those critical questions that we want to ask our students so we can ensure that learning has taken place. And in much the same way, I would say to school leaders, have those critical questions as you're thinking about practice, thinking about engaging with communities. And so that's, I think, is very important in really finding synergies between these different theories, understanding them, and really, again, as I say, understanding whole notion of white supremacy and how it is manifested in educational policies, and begin to see maybe there are some things that are happening in your school, happening in the way online learning is happening. There are different issues that teachers are raising that you can begin to say, maybe we need to begin to look at the policies. So again, another thing I would also suggest to keep equity at the center of the work is do not afraid to be vulnerable. Do not be afraid to acknowledge what you know and what you don't know, and what we need to work on. I think that's very important, and that also is where the sort of critical friends, critical group, and collaborative space comes in. It's what I call in some of my work tensions of practice, both personal and professional, that also be mindful of as we engage in these many ways. So again, it's all of not abandoning social justice, not abandoning equity, because equity is about challenging inequities. And we do know that it's about our students who are keeping at the center of all of this. And so that's very important as well. I think it's also important to in in keeping equity at the center is to think about our relationship with colleagues in this time. As Pam said, these are stressful times, and all of my school leader friends and colleagues are explaining that we're going to be hearing from Jackie shortly around some of the issues that she's dealing with as a practicing school leader. However, it's so important to think about those relationships because equity and anti-racist work is also about empathy, love, and care. And I think we care for our students, we care for ourselves, and we also have to care about our colleagues. And I think it's really again ensuring that we're having those conversations, those critical dialogue as a school leader. If a colleague is now engaging in teaching and learning in a manner that is not conducive to some students doing well, that conversation might have to happen, and of course support that colleague in understanding what equity, what social justice is all about. So that's I think is very important as well. I think it's also important to really begin to think about ways in which to look at some of the data in their schools, even though we're in COVID time and things are different and we're looking at different issues that we have to deal with. I would also say to school leaders that it's important in your schools, in your board, to continue. I know we do not have a lot of race based data in some school boards, but continue to look at the suspension data, continue to look at how students are placed, continue to look at how students are being supported. It's not just giving students a laptop or a electronic device. It's also important in terms of the tone, the conversation, and all of those things, and in terms of data for your school as well as maybe what's in the board. And so it's really, as I would say, creating a plan. It's also important to create a plan for equity and how all of this will be embedded in daily practice and daily work. The So I'm going to shift quickly in the time that I have left in around now, how is it sustained and how do we support that journey? And so, building on some of those ideas and suggestions that I've just made around embedding that into practice, how do we sustain it and how do we keep this journey going? And the first thing that I want to say is really around this idea of of recognizing that equity is also about self care and the care of others. And really, it's important to recognize when there are vulnerabilities. I also want to say to recognize that some days we might not be able to take this up today, but we will be able to take it up tomorrow. It doesn't mean you're abandoning the journey. As I have on the slide here, we have to learn to dismantle the status quo and recognizing that it's exhausting. Dismantling white supremacy is not easy. Everyone is saying how tired they are, both emotionally, physically, intellectually, just tired. So I think it's important to sustain this journey, to recognize that sometimes we have to take a rest. Sometimes it's okay to not be vulnerable in a space. Sometimes it's okay to reach out for help. Sometimes it's okay to say, I am not able to do this by myself, and to really draw on the community for that support. And it's that going to that nugget that we talk about in terms of building those relationships. So again, all of these things, if we were to create a visual, they're interconnected. They're interconnected. They are iterative. They inform in terms of how we're going to ensure that we maintain and keep equity at the center and the focus. And so, in wrapping up, in terms of some concrete actions, and maybe this is reiterating some of the ideas that I've already shared. Again, have some resources. School leaders do not have to know everything about everything all in a moment. It is recognized that there is room to learn. What we're holding school leaders accountable for, we're holding them are holding school leaders accountable for the learning, the unlearning, and the practice. Holding school leaders accountable to not continuing in ways that are not supporting BIPOC students. I've already mentioned the whole idea of having a critical friends and having a collaborative space. And of course, we must ever there's as I would say right now, there should be no school leader anywhere in Ontario or Canada who doesn't acknowledge that systemic racism exists and that white supremacy is something that needs to be challenged in education. And so, again, those common agreements and really seeing this as a journey, arming oneself with the knowledge and practice to go forward. So I'm going to stop here and turn over to Jackie, and then hopefully we'll have some questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Anne. So yes, let's talk about the actual practice of everything and where we're at currently. It's really quite an interesting experience to be a school leader during this time. And we're certainly presented with a number of challenges in addressing all of the issues that have been outlined by both Pamela and Anne. And also the day-to-day operations of a school that can be quite complex. So I just wanted to share with you some of the, I'll say, challenges and some of the opportunities that I think do exist, even in very difficult times. I think that no matter where you start out, and no matter how difficult the times are, I think there are always opportunities for change and for learning in your environment. So some of the challenges we've certainly faced as leaders in a system, and they generally revolve around, I would say probably the biggest challenge is communication. And a lot of the communication challenges we're facing currently really are based on the evolutionary nature of dealing with a pandemic and dealing with the expectations that are coming to us from all sorts of directions. So, we get information. I'll give you a perfect example of something that's happened sort of on a day-to-day basis. We will work hard to communicate information to our staff, to our parents, to our students. And we lay out this strong plan of attack related to communication. And then 3 or 4 days later, the information changes. And we're tasked with going out and sharing that information again. And it can be really challenging for families and for kids, and certainly for our staff members, our colleagues, to adjust and adapt on the fly. We know that when folks are faced with change, it can be very unnerving and very difficult to navigate. And folks are being tasked with adjusting to change pretty much on a daily basis. So some of those things present a great deal of challenge when it comes to communication. There's also a sense of urgency often that comes along with the information that we need to share. And that, certainly as Pamela outlined early on, provides a great deal of stress for administrators. There's an urgency to get information out. So again, an example in practice, last night, we had a situation where we were contacted by public health that a student in our school had tested positive, and they were starting the tracing process, and it looking like it may have generated back to our school. So immediately, 8 o'clock at night, there's communication with superintendents, there's communication with public health, and there's an urgency to connect with families and with students in order to meet all the policies and processes that are in place and required by public health. So it's incredibly stressful for folks when they are working 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, just to ensure that the basic level of communication is shared so that we can have consistent and accurate information. Certainly dealing with protocols, health protocols, changes in delivery methods for curriculum, dealing with technological issues. All of these things are emerging, and again, addressing the needs of kids who may be sick in your building, et cetera, or whose families require extra support, or maybe looking at a different learning model. Those are all things that are kind of the day-to-day operations that do put a tremendous amount of stress on administrators and challenge the work that they really want to be doing in terms of growth and development for their staff. Some other challenges related to that, and specifically kind of is the nature of the beast right now, certainly from my perspective. The idea that a lot of the information is really coming from the top down, and there's not a lot of room for dialogue and discussion around what might be the most appropriate course of action. Generally speaking, the information comes to us in a memo or in a very brief meeting, often minutes before the remainder of teachers or support staff or families get the information. And that can be incredibly difficult to address, particularly if that information is changing. And again, I'll speak to an example. We started out, so I'm in an Ontario secondary school, and we're using a quadmester model right now. So students take 2 classes for 10 weeks, and then they rotate through so that they are able to complete 8 courses over the course of a year. And very little discussion had been worked through in terms of what the model might look like, how the implementation might happen, and the timelines related to that, and the tightness of those timelines. So when those processes come down, we're usually given perhaps a week or 2 to completely adjust and reschedule kids and re-timetable kids and get students into a different space. And that's normally a process that can take us up to 6 weeks to do under normal circumstances. They're being asked of us in a week. And in our model, they're going to be asked of us every quadmester, because we also offer a virtual high school environment for students who wish to go fully online. And it really speaks to my next point, which has really continued to challenge me as a leader. And that's the wrestling between our desire to provide flexibility for all of our students and our need to ensure that the process is equitable for all kids. So again, one of the challenges we run into based on our system right now is that we have opened up an opportunity for students and families to move by the middle of November into full online learning. And of course, the implications for that of a school are tremendous. What it means is if we have a number of kids move out of our building and decide that they want to go virtual, they will be transferred into the virtual school, but it also has implications for the number of staff we have at the school and the number of sections we're offering students in terms of options. So it's very unique in the sense that the system has provided opportunity for those who can find accessing education online easy. They've provided the transitional pieces to make that quite seamless for them. So our students who are moving from the face-to-face and are offering up an opportunity to go virtual, the transition is reasonably seamless for them. They're able to move in. And we know that in the current state of things, certainly the likelihood of students switching models into the virtual model, it's far more likely based on the continuous projection of numbers going upwards. So as students transition into that model, those students are taken care of. What concerns me and the challenge that I find systemically is that the students who often struggle with access online, the students who struggle because of special education needs, the students who have traditionally not been well served by our education system, our Black students, our Indigenous students, our students of color. All of those students are being left to manage or potentially manage in a system that is not set out for them. If they decide that being at school in the face-to-face environment is where they need to be to access their education, what's happening in this current state and this current model is that as students move to virtual, we have less options, less choices, less opportunities for kids in our school who are staying here. And so their timetables, their course selection, their experience at the school level becomes jeopardized because we have enabled a system that encourages this flexibility. So there's a real tug of war for me in terms of wanting kids to have the flexibility they need, but also recognizing that the system inherently continues to disadvantage students that we are professing to want to take better care of based on the language we're talking about in terms of anti-racist education and inclusionary practices. So I find that to be a tremendous challenge. And when you speak about those challenges, to your superintendents, to the larger context, the pushback again, and the challenge for administrators is you need to deal with that at the school level. And so again, it speaks nicely to some of the points that Anne was raising around the systemic inequities that continue to exist, and the additional challenges it presents to administrators who are trying to navigate those. Having said that, I do believe there's still opportunities, and I do believe that there's still a space for us to accomplish great things in the system. Certainly, that the forced nature of change that we've been experiencing has really encouraged a significant amount of learning, growth, and development with our staff. Forced or otherwise, but it's certainly, we've talked long about the value of being accessible online and being regularly accessible. Certainly the model that we have in place now kind of forces our hand in that. And so there are opportunities there, and we have seen growth in many cases with our staff who perhaps have not spent a great deal of time looking at their own professional practice, and they've kind of been forced into that position because things have had to change so rapidly and information is coming and at them very quickly. And they've done a phenomenal job of adapting and having a willingness to continue to adapt. I will suggest, though, that there will likely be a spot where you just can't do much more. And that's always the challenge too for folks, is that there's a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of desire to do well by kids, but at some point that runs out when the changes are so continuous and so challenging. And, again, for teachers, when a timetable is going to change, potentially for quadmester 2, 3, 4, it also means that what they have probably spent the first 10 weeks prepping for, they may not be teaching. And to deliver that message to teachers is incredibly difficult, because we know they've been planning, we know they have been wanting to do a good job. And to have that significant of an adjustment on a very short, in a very short period of time presents some challenges for sure. I will say again, opportunities. We've certainly seen new leaders in our system emerge, folks who have really taken the lead in terms of technology, and also found a voice in many different ways to share learning and information with their colleagues. So that's been a really nice thing to see. And we certainly have seen those opportunities present themselves, and people step up to the plate in tremendous ways, both formally and informally. And again, I think that the system, the community, and our students, there seems to be much more of an openness to change. And I think that that is helpful when we look at the potential opportunities for really digging into anti-racist work in the school system, and continuing to focus on that work. What's really great, I'm really grateful for, is a lot of the work around anti-racist education and challenging systemic racism. Certainly in my building, we've worked really hard at over a number of years. And what I was able to say to staff, and I think that this is what's so important for leaders, is that, as Anne suggested, it can't be just an add-on. It has to be something that you build into the culture and the language of everything you do. And so for us, the opportunity to dig into that on a greater level is really, really important, and it allows us really to continue the work and to say to staff, listen, we're not doing an add-on here. We're going to continue to focus on the work that we've been doing for a number of years. This is not an add-on. It's who we are. It's what we believe in, and it's what we're going to continue to grow and develop. That doesn't happen overnight. And so if you are directed by a school board or to say we're going to focus on anti-racist work right now, there really needs to be a commitment at the administrative level in that school to say, not only is a commitment now, but it's going to be a commitment for years moving forward. And everything you do and say and direct in your school must focus through that lens. And in order to get all that amazing work done, you have to make sure that you've got colleagues and you've developed positive relationships with folks in order to make that happen. You cannot do it alone. It's incredibly difficult and challenging work. And the other area I would say as a school leader that becomes really advantageous to us is valuing the time of your colleagues and valuing the time of your staff. And you do that by finding creative ways to give them a respite from the crazy amount of work and change that they've had to manage, and provide them with opportunities to breathe and to also focus on the work that you really want to get to. It's not just about the protocols. It's not just about the sanitizing. It's not just about the day-to-day operations and how you navigate in an online environment. What really matters is to give them the opportunity to dialogue and learn that's structured and focused and values the amount of work it takes and the time it takes to do the work. And so we're trying to do that by buying some time for staff to get together in small teams to continue the good work in their departments of extending their learning around anti-racist education and how that transitions into their curriculum. But it really is intentional and actionable work that leaders must take in order to ensure that the focus remains there. Even though we can get really tied up in the day-to-day operations and the nuts and the bolts of what's going on and the anxiousness about managing everything, we always have to focus on learning for kids and learning with each other in order to really drive a successful educational system.
Thanks, Jackie. Thank you. We're almost at time. And so I'm just going to do a little bit of a quick wrap up, and hopefully we'll have some time for our participants to put some questions in the chat that we can respond to. So just a brief summary. Really, Pamela laid the foundation very well for us in terms of looking at some of the dialogue, the conversations that school leaders are having around well-being, managing during these COVID times, and really focusing on some of the things that they're learning, and some of the issues and challenges and the possibilities. And I think Jackie, in many ways, concretize those in the day-to-day lived experiences around the timetabling and the responding and the urgency, and really having to juggle many balls in schools and working with communities. And I really liked what Jackie talked about, this the finding the flexibility while we're allowing access in one area, there are tensions in another. And really, in terms of the focus that I brought to this around how do we keep anti-racist social justice work at the center, and that tension that Jackie raised around balancing and looking at the policies, and when we make a change here, who is being impacted, and really recognizing that there are systemic inequities, and COVID-19 simply laid those bare. And so I'm going to stop here just so that our participants can have the next 5 minutes or so to ask some questions, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to respond to some of their questions.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Jackie. And so Benita, I think, is going to shift to the questions. If people have some questions, here we go. We've shared a lot of information, so people are probably processing. Wait time in education is always a very interesting piece, giving people time to think about what they're thinking about.
And as well, we're waiting for the questions to populate. I think we can continue to have a little bit of dialogue, and I really wanted to focus in on something that Jackie mentioned around because it's so central to the discourse now around online teaching versus face to face, and really around that bit of allowing parents the flexibilities, but how is that impacting, and really maybe the questions we ask around equity, and how some of the inequities, and how does that impact some of the work we want to do. So I thought that was very, very interesting. And I don't know, Pam, while we're waiting for questions to populate on the question list, I'm wondering if in your focus group, if the school leaders had any, what were they saying about their issues wrestling with issues of equity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the focus group took place a couple of weeks after school had opened, and we're certainly going to be doing more of them. And one of them is going to have a stronger focus to ask people specifically more about the equity. The first one was kind of an open opportunity for school leaders to kind of share what was kind of on their plates at the moment. And certainly, while the day-to-day managing of schools became a challenge, they were also very concerned, as Jackie has mentioned here, about the issues around the availability of the different learning options for different families and groups of people within the school, the lack of access and devices, particularly for groups that may be living in rural and remote areas and who don't have very good access to internet. And concerned also about who was following up with those students that were not really able to join online, but also were not able to come face to face because of extenuating health circumstances. And so there was still a lot at that time of students that were still attempting, I think, to navigate the system and figure out if they could get the supports they needed to be able to do the online, because they weren't able to come to school. And they certainly noted that there seemed to be some equity lines there in terms of who's able to access some of these opportunities. So yeah, so they are speaking about it, and I do hope to probe that a little further as we move through the project. We do have a question here. Oh, we do have a question here where Andre has asked, how do you define systemic racism and white supremacy in reference to your statement about addressing these policies? So Anne, I'll let you speak to that. Was your point?
Yes, and so first of all, I'm not going to offer, I don't think we have time for sort of a definition of systemic racism, but suffice to say that when we speak of racism as being systemic, it means those practices and policies that have been in place that have adversely affected Black, Indigenous students of color. And so those you would find systemic racism in assessment practices, in suspension practices. To give a real life example, you'd have two students, say, horsing around. The Black student gets sent home for 5 days for fighting. The white kid is told, oh, you just need to be redirected. So we speak about systemic racism. It's those practices that emerge from people's thinking around what they believe about other groups and then act on those thinking. So that's systemic racism. It's about power. It's about impacting other people's lives and their educational outcomes. White supremacy really is racism and white supremacy are kind of, are, it's just one and the same. When we speak of white supremacy, what we're speaking out specifically is the dominance of Eurocentric knowledge that has really dominated spaces for many years. It is this white supremacist whole idea of what was taught in schools about history, that Christopher Columbus discovered the West, or that he discovered Canada, when in fact there were indigenous people living here and this is their land. White supremacy is about being racist. It is about not acknowledging that knowledge from Black and Indigenous people and people of color matter. It's all that Eurocentrism that has been in the textbook, the history book, the geography, and all of that, the way in which the continent of Africa was positioned vis-a-vis Europe. So that is white supremacy and in action. In reference to how this is addressed in policy, we know that much of the folks who have been in education, who have been making and creating policies, have been white folks, where their knowledge have dominated the space. And so, in terms of what is viewed as knowledge, what is viewed, how is discipline taken up, what is viewed as assessment, what is viewed as evaluation, if we there is, and in fact, how we create barriers to exclude non-white folks. There is a reason why much of education, universities or K to 12, much of the principals are white, the teachers are white. It's not because Black and Indigenous and people of color do not have knowledge. It's because white people have taken that space, kept it to themselves, because they felt that their knowledge was superior and dominant. That's white supremacy. It also can be violent in terms of ways in which those relationships occur. But specifically to education, we see it every day. We have data to show that Black and Indigenous students are pushed out of schools. They're suspended more. They're not in academic courses. And this is particularly in Ontario, and we see it all across in the judicial system, in policing. So those are examples of white supremacy, not only in education, but in society as a whole.
And so then the next question here, comes from Carolyn. What critical, crucial steps would you recommend that school districts should take to best transform our practices to genuinely be inclusive of all identities in staff as well as students and communities? I don't know, Jackie, if you might have something to add here.
I think Jackie would be great at this in terms of how she changed the learning culture at her school.
Yes, thanks, Anne. I do think that there are some steps we can take both within our school communities, but on the broader district level as well. And I would suggest, first of all, it is gathering some data from the folks that are most impacted by the policies and practices in your space. So for us at a school level, what we did was we reached out to our students of color to ask them in a focus group environment, sort of what have their experiences been within the school community in terms of accessing curriculum, in terms of their day-to-day operations, how do they feel, what does it, what's their experience like? And certainly the data that came back to us was in so many ways not surprising, but it was great to be able to share actual quotations from our students, because and they will say, teachers did not address someone being called gay, or someone didn't, the teacher didn't address someone making use of the N word in the hall. They will be very specific about things that made them feel very uncomfortable. That data was helpful because we could go back to our staff and say, here's the information that our kids shared with us. This isn't, it didn't allow anyone the space to say, oh, well, that doesn't happen here. It happens here. And so that data was important. So in terms of a district or a system, being able to talk to educators of color, LGBTQ educators, and gather data from the educator's perspective about how the system does or does not support and meet their needs as educators, and certainly doing that on a grander level to do focus groups with your students from a variety of different areas, because I would imagine that the information that school districts would get from a variety of situations will look different and sound different, and that's important. But I think I don't think you can do any of this work unless you have some real data to go from, because people will go to, well, that's what happens over here, or that's what happens over there. And we need people to understand it's happening here. It's happening in this space, and this is the language that is being used. So that would be the first thing. And then from that data is really creating a critical group of folks who can action change in your buildings, in the system. And it's great to talk about all of this stuff, but the reality is, how do we change practice for teachers, and how do we change the experience for kids? And so we have to, in our case, we brought together a group of educators in our school who wanted to take on that work, who wanted to lead that work, who wanted to lead by example. And again, we provided intentional time for our staff to engage in that work, and also to help them to recognize that they don't need to throw out everything that they have been doing over time. I think there's always a fear that and that's why things feel like an add-on, because they feel like, oh, we're doing something completely different now. And the way we've positioned the work is that, no, the work that you are doing is good work. And you have to honor and respect that in people, or they will have no desire to engage. So you have to honor and respect what they bring to the table, but also to help them fill in the gaps for what they're missing. So some really basic things in terms of instructional practice that we looked at were being able to say to our teachers, this is what you're doing in a particular area. So let's say in the English subject area, we're looking and saying, okay, we're using these texts. We can't throw out all the texts. We can't throw out all the resources that we have, but we can position the learning from a different lens, and from a critical lens, and from an anti-racist lens, to say whose voices are missing in the dialogue. How can we supplement those? How would somebody's experience engage with this material in a different way?
I just quickly want to add quickly to something that Jackie said, which I think is very important. Two quick things. One, sometimes some practices need to be disrupted, and doing it, it's not okay to do it the same way. So I just want to say that sometimes some of those practices need to be disrupted, need to be gotten rid of. Quickly, I just want to quickly say to Carolyn as well, that you do not have to have Black, Indigenous, students of color in your school to engage in anti-racist work. There's this belief out there in some spaces that if you don't see Black people or racialized people, this work is happens there. No, this work is for everyone, even if you have a predominantly white student population or teaching staff. They also have to engage with their biases, their ideas and thinking, and really that work is for them as well in that space. Just wanted to add that quickly to what Jackie said.
I would agree with that as well. And I know that when I first started doing work around how one of the projects I was working on pre-COVID was how school administrators were supporting and enacting the TRC calls to action in schools. And sometimes, again, there was this comment that, well, I don't have Indigenous students in my school, and so we're not really focusing on that. And first off, the likelihood in Saskatchewan, at least, is that you probably do have Indigenous students in your school, even though they may not be necessarily self-identified. But it is really important for that work to happen with non-Indigenous and white people. In some ways, arguably, it could even be more important in the sense that for many of them, they may not necessarily have acknowledged or been exposed to this type of thinking prior. And so I think that that's a really important point that you make about that. This is not just about, it certainly is important to create better systems for Black, Indigenous, and students of color, but it's also important that there's that the white folks in schools don't get to escape this kind of conversation. So I think
and I
Can I just
can
quickly add some? Can can I just quickly add one quick thing that we also, as we're talking about this, to think about also intradiversity. I know many in the South Asian community have been talking about brown complicity, and they've been created a South Asian aligned network where we also have to think about communities where getting close to whiteness then perpetuates behaviors that are also damaging to Black, Indigenous people of color. We've also talked about the model minority. And so we also have to be mindful, while not pitting one group against another, we also have to be mindful of those behaviors that white supremacy perpetuates of getting close to whiteness, and what does that look like within particular groups as well. As I said, my colleague Dr. Herveen Singh talks and writes about brown complicity, and that is something, so there was a webinar about that as well. So really just to put that there as well for school leaders who might have different groups within their schools, and how do they engage in and sustain anti-racist work.
Thanks, Anne. Jackie, over to you for the final word before we.
Well, what I was just going to say, even is related to the comment that's there. Yes, student voices are incredibly important. And what I will say is that our students want this. Our students want to learn. They are engaging socially. They want to participate in this learning. They are yearning for it. They have access to all of this information and experiences across the world. They are truly global citizens, as much as we are stuck at home right now, but they are truly engaging in the work across continents. And it's so incredibly important that we lead this work for our kids, because their voices, as suggested here, their voices are what's telling us we need this, we want this. Please give us an avenue, a voice to develop our thinking and our learning around these topics, and give us an opportunity to lead this work going forward.
Well, thanks, Jackie. I think that's actually a really great point to end on, bringing it all the way back to the students and the purpose of why we all engage in this work. And so thank you very much to Dr. Ann Lopez and Dr. Jackie Button for joining us today. And thank you to all of you for joining us and tuning in. And we've got our contact information here. You can follow us on Twitter and let us know if there's any additional questions or follow-up. And I do believe that there is a survey or a feedback form that will come from EdCan that also allows you a space to give some additional feedback. So thank you all very much. The work continues and lots left to be learned. And so maybe we'll be joining you again sometime to share some more about what we're continuing to learn as the intersections of COVID and inequity continue to create the context of current schooling. So thank you very much. Have a great day, and we'll see you sometime soon.